the cold heaven. Suddenly, I saw the cold and rook delighting heaven, that seemed as though ice burned and was but more ice, and thereupon imagination and heart were driven so wild that every casual thought of that and this vanished, and left but memories that should be out of season with the hot blood of youth, of love crossed long ago, and I took all the blame out of all sense and reason, until I cried and trembled and rocked to and fro, riddled with light. Ah, when the ghost begins to quicken, confusion of the deathbed over, it is sent out naked on the roads, as the books say, and stricken by the injustice of the skies for punishment.
To give us a sense of where this book came from, your inspiration, and even the process of writing it.
Well, thank you, Colleen, and thanks to everybody who's participating. Thanks to Lisa for those amazing, generous words, which I treasure deeply. And thanks on behalf of our whole audience for the enormous treat of hearing your reading of those beautiful poems. Well, Colleen, and thank you, Colleen. Thanks, everyone. You know, the book is organized around lines of Yeats's poetry, and I hadn't intended actually to quote 2 lines, but I think I'll start with them, and then I'll, in the Irish way, get back to answering the question. The 2 lines that are in my mind are the famous 2 lines that are in the Municipal Gallery Revisited, where Yeats is looking around the gallery at portraits of his friends and founders of the Irish state. And he says, think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say, my glory was I had such friends. So in listening to Lisa's beautiful words and knowing each of you who are participating, those thoughts were in my mind. Now, as to the origin of the book, it had seemed to me that a lot of people who don't necessarily consider themselves readers of poetry, nonetheless, when they're facing some threshold occasion, ask some friend of theirs whom they think of as a reader of poetry, can you give me a line of poetry that might fit this occasion? And Yeats had an extraordinary ability to be just that poet, because he had an ability to distill the emotions that surrounded events in personal life or in national or global life. And he could put those thoughts into very memorable words. And I think that a lot of people, well, many people have not had the benefit of the wisdom that's in those words, because Yeats has a reputation for being difficult, and that you have to get through a lot of philosophy or politics or something else to get to the poetry. And so it seemed to me that looking at some of the lines line by line was a way to distill and get access to the wisdom. And then frequently, once you were kind of owned that line, you got into the poem and you were more interested in the whole poem, and then you led to another poem and to another. So the idea behind the book and what made it come into life was to look at the poems line by line and find that wisdom echoing back into life.
It's also, though, the object itself, the book itself, is an extraordinarily beautiful book, with its cover sort of reminiscent of Sturge Moore's cover for The Winding Stair, for Yeats's The Winding Stair. And inside there are reproductions of manuscript pages, pictures of, I know you well, I know you know Tuair Ballylee well, and pictures from Tuair Ballylee, of Yeats, for example, hanging out in a garden in London. In many ways, it's a sort of the words, Yeats's words are surrounded by the objects of his life, and the objects of the archives. And I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about your choices in designing the book and in bringing us to Yeats's archive as much as to his words.
Well, great. Thanks, Colleen. I'm glad you mentioned that. And hats off to Antony Farrell at Lilliput Press, who is interested in beautiful books, and Marcia Swan, who designed the book, and everybody at Lilliput who made a beautiful book and who were interested in making a beautiful book, and Niall McCormick, who designed the cover. And you mentioned the Sturge Moor winding stair. I don't know if you could see, there's a photo of the actual winding stair inside Torbally Lee on the one side, and on the other is the Sturge Moor cover for Yeats's volume called The Winding Stair. Yeats also, the volume that preceded The Winding Stair was called The Tower, and that's the Sturge Moor, the Tower cover. So our cover is a pastiche in a way, or an homage to the Sturge Moor cover. And part of the idea was Yeats had this interesting observation that a lyric poem can take on a second beauty, passing out of literature, as it were, and into life. And so I kind of had the image in my own mind of the words coming down from the tower where he spent the summers in the middle of his life, and echoing down that staircase into life. Now, you wouldn't, I tried to sell Antony Farrell on the idea of using that photograph on the cover, and he said, no, it looked like echoing into a dungeon. So I said, well, maybe we could draw one. And fortunately,
I mean, I take it Yeats's tower wasn't very comfortable.
No, I think it wasn't. It was a real stone tower. Well, but it's the most amazing place. And Sylvia Plath said you could, when she went there with Ted Hughes and Richard Murphy, she said she could sense Yeats's presence. And I'll be darned, you can, and you do. So the tower was very much in my mind in the making of the book and in the images in the book. Also, the Cool, my children know how much I love Cool, and the poem The Wild Swans at Cool. And so some beautiful photographs of the wild swans at Cool in the book. Seamus Heaney's beautiful poem Postscript involves some swans just up the road on the Clare shore of Galway Bay. And he said to me one time, I might as well have called it The Wild Swans at Clare. And so I have a beautiful photo by Deirdre Holmes of some wild swans at Cool and at Clare. And one other thing I want to mention about the images in the book is, and I want to thank the National Library of Ireland, Sandra Collins particularly, and Catherine McSherry for all their help on the book, and the special collections at UCD, University College Dublin, for their contribution of artifacts that make up the book. But the National Library gave me this beautiful image of Yeats's ring, which his wife, George, commissioned for him just before their marriage. And he wrote a poem explaining it, which includes the line, "And wisdom is a butterfly and not a gloomy bird of prey." And this beautiful ring is on loan from the Yeats family in the National Library of Ireland. And it's part of the beautiful exhibit there.
Joe's book gives some great clarity of thought to this in the chapter on work. And he talks a lot about, is it either happiness or art, as Wilco writes, and Joe quotes, or is it more like Zadie Smith said, it's like trying to re-examine the checks and balances. And that's also one of the great things too about this book, is that Joe brings in all these other voices that have been influenced by Yeats. And I just think it's a really incredible way to kind of chart the seismograph, like a seismograph of poetic influence. And you can see these little earthquakes here and bigger ones over here. But yeah, as a public and private person and as a poet, it has to be that the well of poetry runs deep within me, because I tap it on both fronts. I tap in one regard. During the day, I am all about championing the work of others, of getting people into poetry. I call myself a poetry proselytizer for this reason. You know, if you tell me that you don't like poetry, I'll find a poem just for you that will open you up to the idea of it. And so it becomes this idea of this work-life balance, which I thought was really interesting that Joe, you know, talked about. But it also becomes the idea of, I don't have to subsist on poetry as a living per se. So it gives me a fluidity and a flexibility that I know a lot of my peers don't always have. And I think it allows me to still feel as if I can, like I said, that I can bring other people up during the day and make sure that people are feeling tuned into poetry, but yet still have enough that I can tap and create my own work. And thanks to residencies and retreats, like, you know, things like these, they help keep me centered as a poet in my own work, but then they also still at the same time help introduce me to other poets. So it's a checks and balances. There are times when maybe it's too much energy on one end and not enough on another, but I like what Zadie Smith said in Joe's book, that it is that checks and balances, and you have to go in. And I think a lot about the way that Yeats went about kind of this public-private life, they all influence each other in so many ways in my mind, looking at his work, especially the private, and thinking about himself as one of the last romantics.
Joe, I'm delighted to be here to help you celebrate this amazing book. And I read the book first in a draft when the ink was still wet. And I've seen it condense into this form over the months. And last October, when it was launched over here in Ireland, again, I read through, and just, you used the word net, I think, Colleen, and you used it as well, Teri Cross. And I had this sense with the book of a fisherman hauling in this net of ideas and people Yeats was connected to, and resonant images from his life, all brought together for us here. And it's a fantastic lens to either introduce somebody to Yeats or to reacquaint yourself with Yeats if you had him back in the day in school. But it's more than Yeats echoing into our lives. It's Joe coming in like in his rags of light, the lovely phrase from The Cold Heaven, riddled with light. And it is a book riddled with light. I first, as I said, read it cover to cover, but over the months of this wild pandemic, I've been using it much as Yeats might have if it was on his desk, as a kind of a scrying book. Oh, what might the day bring? And I'll open it at random, and I'm totally then riveted into a place of wisdom and insight that really does help me get through these strange days. Today, when I got up, I went towards the end of the book, and I saw his gravestone with Patti Smith's, your great song maker and poet, her photograph of Yeats's grave. And it's amazing to me that when visitors come to Ireland, especially people who've had him as part of their education, they want to go and visit his grave. They want to see it. I remember Ginsberg coming, where would you like to see in Ireland? Yeats's grave. So this sense of the half-life of a great poet echoing on, like he's had a half-life of over 100 years. He's 152 years now since he was born, and his half-life is still echoing on and on. So congratulations, Joe.
Beauty. Can I read a sentence?
Oh, please. Yeah.
I mean, there's so many, but it's from the story Two Silences. And he'd returned then to his own bed, where sleep would eventually come to him too, but only in those deep and dark places, plumbed most deeply and darkly in the moments just before he woke again in the morning. I'm like, oh my God. There's an accuracy and a precision that's in all of your work, that engineer side of you. There's nothing, You really, you don't use any words to decorate your stories. There's no, but I just think that there's that whatever way the Russian hit the Irish, hit the art, hit the engineering, there's just as well as all the thematic stuff and the surreal stuff and etc. There's very, very beautiful just plain writing in it, which actually reminds me it's kind of Chekhov, Flaubert, that very precise.
Yeah, no, it's funny because like when I was writing, when I started doing the creative writing courses, I hadn't written creatively since my Leaving Cert exam in 1995. So like I had left any sort of creative writing or anything like that, and I worked as an engineer. So you're writing formal reports and specifications, and it's passive language, and it's, you know, it's kind of what primary structure language, and it's kind of you know, there's absolutely no decoration. It's completely inappropriate to be writing decoratively in an engineering report. You know, the stunning beams were arched grandly across the side. I was like, what are you talking about? And I think that was definitely something like that would be in me, that kind of it's now I think of it like when I try to write, when I try to be precise, I try to kind of deaden myself, you know, I try to kind of just fall out of myself while I'm writing, as if I'm kind of like pulling, as if I've removed my heart, you know, and I'm sitting there emptied out somehow. And that's how I kind of, that's how I enjoy when I feel like there's something dropped out of me. That's when I'm writing and I can feel there's the precision coming. And that's the, then by doing that, then ideas start coming as you write. And a lot of the writing is just me thinking, you know, it's not necessarily me trying to produce writing, it's just thinking, you know. Of course there's craft and that kind of stuff, but a lot of the first instances of the writing is just sort of the order of my thoughts, you know, and the form of them, let's say, or the contours of them, or whatever. And that's, I think, where that kind of, so within that situation then, to be reaching for decorative or convincing words in a sort of decorative way, convincing, to me that's the work of an advertiser, you know, or someone working in sales. And this is not my role, you know. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in trying to say what it is that I'm trying to say. And the idea then of the relationship then with entertainment, let's say, or the idea that the reader will enjoy it, is very, very secondary. But then there are, of course, times where you're like, yeah, that would be funny to say, you know, or something like that. Or yeah, let's go drier still because that'd be funny, you know. So that's kind of that's the feeling of when I'm writing, that it's that you're just trying to get to the thing, you know. And sometimes it happens and sometimes it just doesn't, you know. Yeah, and like in Prosinecki, you know, the short story.
Yeah.
When I was writing that, this idea came to my head. I've awful trouble with similes. I would put that into the category of, like, I was thinking about more recently, just to use another analogy, actually to use a simile really, that that I think of similes as being not the business of the writer. And I also think of metaphors as not the business of the writer either. And in relationship to metaphors, I always think that the writer is, what I always think of the writer in that case as being someone who's footing a row of turf, right? And they're working on the row of turf and they're footing this row of turf. And over their back, behind them, there are clouds forming. And they are none of their business. The clouds are for the other people to look at and to put together and to pull together, this kind of stuff. But your work is to produce, is to work with your back to the sky, you know? And that, I think, and then all these other things will happen because writing produces these thoughts in people. And it's happening whether you know it or not when you're writing. So all of these larger metaphoric aspects or whatever, they're gathering like clouds behind you. And then I think in relation to simile, I remember I came out with this in one of the classes, and I think you were in it, but this is an early problem that I had. I was like, that there should be no similes, that they should be banned, or something controversial like that. I said, I think I was just looking for attention. But anyway, but in Prosinecki, there is a description where the footballer hits particular passes that are, they are measured passes, they're appropriate passes for the situation. So Prosinecki, this footballer, looks at the landscape and decides how best to alter it, you know, and what best pass can I hit, and not which one will the crowd enjoy most. And so he would describe a pass that's showy, you know, a crossfield ping that's not necessary, when actually the 5-yard pass that way is far better. That would be a sentence, that would be a simile without a sentence. And that was that analogy that'd be a philosophy that I would kind of actually hold myself towards writing. And that, I think, produces the kind of maybe the drier end of the writing, is this kind of, I don't know if it's not intentionally austere. I don't think it is, but I think that might be to describe it. I don't know, but that's my relationship with those two things, like metaphors and similes. They're not my business,
That's fascinating.
Because I remember when I was writing these, I was also studying the bungalow bliss houses for my. I was doing a master's in art in the contemporary world, is the name of the master's, up at NCAD. So it was like all this stuff was mixing around, and so I started realizing that, like, if there were a sort of a sub theme to my project, it is to make Soviet the Irish countryside. I mean, that's absolutely no aim at all, but I realized that that's something that's going on. But what I found was that what I found is kind of the sort of the type of modernity, let's say, the building modernity that happened in Ireland. So from once the state, and like say from the early mid-1940s, with the rural electrification scheme and the Mona developments, and then subsequently with the bungalow bliss and all of these different planning changes. And when you started looking at things like planning information documents and this kind of stuff during my research, I realized that actually the relationship that Irish people have, in actuality, from the country, with the landscape, the beautiful Irish landscape, is extremely pragmatic and extremely mathematical. And that to me then was really interesting, that, this idea of the Irish landscape being something very beautiful and Irishness being something lyric. I was like, no, it's not like that at all. It's actually, it has nothing to do with what it looks like in literature. It's actually, to me, more like this. So that started becoming, so I just sort of went on that route. I was like, why can't it be like this as well, And so that's why, like, people talk like they say they're from Ballyman, or I'm from, but like say, so in design number 108, what you have is a very, very Russian style story, let's say. Yeah. But it's about a bungalow, and all the dialogue and chatting in it, and the tone of voice is Irish, like it doesn't sound like a Russian person. And I'm not trying to do that. So that would be an example of like where that intermeshing just kind of happened, And it wasn't something, I wasn't planning it. You look back at it and you go, oh, that's what's happening. You're not like, oh, I'm going to do this,
No.
Yeah. And that's the kind of thing, I think. And I would say, like, in terms of like your work, I would say as well, from what, like, I read your book last year, actually twice. I thought it was lovely. I thought it was brilliant. And it was like, when I was reading, I was like, there's no one writing like this in Ireland. Like, there's no one who writes like this at all. And I just found that idea that, yes, I recognize some of this Russian patterning and Russian structures and this kind of absurd kind of layering going onto it. But at no moment was I kind of like, did I feel like it was was it being over egged? It was just like, what's the texture of the story, as opposed to, or what's the kind of the rhythm of the story, and then what's actually in it, what's it saying, what are the words sounding like, and this kind of stuff. So there's all these kind of levels and registers that I see in your work, and that I would like to think would kind of happen in my work as well. That kind of where there's patterns that are not recognizable, say, or are strange, but then there's lots of things that are very, very kind of let's say recognizable, and like a bungalow.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. It's like we took the same drug. It had slightly different effects, but the freedom, I think, is the same. I think that we were very lucky in those days, even though it's not that many years ago, that the amount of freedom of discussion when like there were often debates, and they could get quite intense, as they should. And I don't think I've ever had a philosophy of writing in that way, but I suppose the only thing I stick to now is a desire to stay uncensored internally, I think, because it's very difficult to to not allow this kind of seepage of changing world around you to seep in. And I don't really want to put any constraints on anything I write.
Yeah.
I don't want to think, ooh, that's a bit.
Yeah.
Because if I start, I'll never write anything. But what I wanted to ask you on that was, did you find with any of these stories that you wrote, oh my God, what is it? Did you ever shock yourself or surprise yourself?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. This is probably the main reason why I write, is because writing is an exploration.
Yeah.
And so if you don't know where you're going, there's nothing wrong or right. There's just, or bad. So everything is an exploration, because you're kind of going, oh, I would never have thought of that in that way. So like the things that I've just taught you there about, simile and metaphors and this kind of stuff, these are thoughts that occur to me when I'm writing, So but in terms of pieces of writing that kind of maybe in this story that I was kind of in this book that I was kind of like, oh, right, didn't see that coming. Yeah, I mean, I can say that pretty easily. Houses by the Sea.
Yeah.
That, you might remember a very early version of that story.
I do. Yeah.
With the cow, the suicidal cow, essentially. That sounds like a sort of schlock horror. it's so kind of, it's not schlocky at all. But that story, so you would read, say, it went up to where Leonard wakes Finn on the ground, and then that's where it ended, the story, first of all. And I was always just convinced that it was complete, or that the narrative arc had been completed or had approached completion. So I decided to continue working on it for years. I mean, I only finished that book. I'd say I started that story in 2009, and I finished it in 2020.
Amazing.
I only actually said that's it now. Yeah, there's 2 or 3 of those stories in here like that. But what I was struck by was the finish of that story. I was really troubled by the way in which Finn treats Leonard, how he sees him as an experiment on will. What does will look like? And I'm going to come back every day and see how my experiment in his will is proceeding. I found that quite chilling. I didn't like that, but I was like, but that is interesting.
I was fascinated with the football stories.
Mm-hmm.
In this. I started watching football a couple of years ago, and I've a slightly addictive personality, so just for a while I'm Champions League tonight kind of stuff, and not in any real way, but the last World Cup I had a chart on my door and I was ticking off the matches, and you just get a bit fascinated by the different styles and so on. So I think it's I don't know, but I do find it amazingly restful to watch it.
Yeah.
Because especially if you're writing, because you don't want to watch like a film, another narrative that's going to interfere with where your head is. So it's like being able to rest, but in a very animated way.
Yeah.
So it's but definitely a new addition and unexpected to my existence. So I got a lot out of that.
Yeah, I think football is fascinating because it is a narrative, who wins this match, and it's a question constantly being asked throughout the thing, and there's structure, and then there's patterns collapsing into it all the time, and it's just looking at it with no one talking is utterly fascinating, and that's why I was kind of for the structure of this book, when I was sort of we were talking, you have this thing when you're when you list your stories in a row, you're well, what one comes after the next? I mean, how do you decide on that? That's such a difficult, and there's so many ways of ordering. It's it's like if there's 12 stories, there's how many different ways to order these 12 stories, And I just thought then one night it hit me, and I was like, this is how I'll do it. I'll do it as a football team. And then I was able to think about the relationship between the stories in a much different way. And all this idea of one following another started becoming less important, or I stopped thinking about it in that way. And then I was thinking that actually the this formation of 4-4-2, I was like, I know this is sort of niche and it's a football thing, but anyone, if you walk, like when the streets were open, if you walk down the street on a Saturday and you stop at a pub and you look in the window, they would have the team sheets up on the thing. So everyone sees these structures all the time. They just might not engage with them as football fans, but they see them. And I was like, well, that's as much an everyday structure as a piece of scaffolding out on the street. Why shouldn't I use that as the structure for the book? And then I started thinking about the stories as having personalities. And because I played a good bit of football when I was younger, I was like, yeah, he would, you know, House by the Sea wouldn't be a centre half. You put him in right back. And then you're like, you know, half bird, half bear, definitely not a midfielder, that's a winger, you know. And it just started becoming really clear. I was like, oh yeah, that's he or she. I don't know exactly what the gender of them are, but yeah.
It is quite amazing. I think it's, you know what I think is wonderful, Adrian, that you for it, that you just, you know, that I think it seems to me to be a great strength of yours, that if you go with how you see it, you know, you don't, you know, you go with how you see it, so you get that it seems to be now intrinsic to this book, this selection, and this form, but it's very like outside of, you know, I think that ability you have to see the lines of how we live, our grooves of existence in different ways is fascinating. But tell me about this.
So I did a few drawings. So the idea was that when you go into a football, I say halftime or before a game, so you go in, you might have a tactics board up on the wall, and there'd be, you know, drawings of that kind. You know, I want you running right, you know, that kind of stuff. So I just said, right, okay, I'll do a few of those. So I just did 3 or 4 of them, 5 or 6 of them, and then I put them down. And then I did another one, and then I tried another one. And then I was just like, I liked the way it was legible through the sort of the thing.
Yes.
And then so it went from a meaningful structure and it collapsed into just meaningless lines, you know, as you turn the page. So you go to meaningless lines and something that potentially has meaning, you know. And then I realized then that when I finished it and I kind of looked at it from a distance, I was like, it kind of looks like a face. So I took a photograph of myself with it up in front of my face, and I thought that's entirely appropriate that this thing is a mask, you know. This book is kind of a mask for me. Because I think there is a certain, and you know, I think by reading your book, I was like, we're like, our books are like, certainly in relation to the work that we've done, there's a kind of a mask effect to the book. It's like, yeah, it's me, but it's, you know, it's not me, you know, it's a different version of me, that's in this, you know, and it's the, how do you say, the fictional me or whatever. And I was interested that because all the stories are more or less written in the first person, that this was like 11 psyches, you know, around a pitch, and that the only one written in the third person is the coach, and he's or she is to one side looking on at this kind of, you know, these atoms running around on a pitch. And that's how I sort of understood it then, the form of the book itself, of the whole thing.
Me, it's always, I can really love something, but would I voluntarily read it again? Because I'm a huge rereader.
Yeah, same here.
And I can really enjoy something, but there are a lot of things that I just know I'm really enjoying this, but I'm never going to read it again.
Yeah.
But your book is a book that will go on the shelf of, I will be taking that down. You know, and that's what I'm doing. And also, because there's great pleasure in that for me. It's like I really, if there's a film I like it much better the second time. Because when you've taken away like plot, then I can really, you know, get in the big bath and, you know, just feel every bit of it. And I like, with short story collections, I like to take it down and just kind of cup of tea and one, you know, and I like to do over and over and over again. And that's what you've written here for me, Adrian, a book that I will be on the shelf with the, like, you know, a friend for life. That's
the highest compliment that you can give me, to be honest. Well, that's always the hope. I think that certainly would be the hope for me, and that you're writing for someone who would want to read it twice, you know. And in a world like today, the idea of revisiting, you know, something that hasn't been turned into like Fast and Furious 8, you know, but actually revisiting something is, I mean, it's very, very important. And I think rereading, like, for instance, your book, The Modern Times, apart from the fact that it's the design, the Sting and Fly one is so handsome and kind of strange as well. Was it Catherine Gaffney designed that, was it?
Yes. It's really, really lovely, isn't it?
It's brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah.
But apart from the fact that I just liked it sitting there on this table, I every now and then, like you, sit down and reread something and just kind of go through it again. And it's like something. It's like looking through when you reread. It's like you're looking through a sort of prism, but the light's a little bit different this time, or you're looking through a slightly different facet of it. It's still the same thing, you know, in that the words haven't changed, but it's different, you know. And I think
when was this? I know you're immersed in nature. I know you live in nature. You love nature. When was the spark of the book that said, "The Kingfisher is the story I want to tell"?
Thank you, Alan. Thank you for such a lovely introduction and such excellent praise for the book. I suppose the story of the Kingfisher and the second book really evolved from the first book. I didn't start out with the intention of doing a second book. I did the first book because of an event that happened in the natural history of Ireland. There was the colonization of Ireland by the woodpeckers, and I felt that should be charted and an account kept down for history, and that's why I wrote the book. And naturally, as you pointed out, I wasn't a writer, an established writer at that stage, so I had no idea how that was going to be received, but I wanted it done. And I suppose the funny thing is that took 3 years to write, 2 or 3 years. And then I had to plan the launch by myself. So I was all immersed in it and it became part of the life. And what astounded me was on the night of the launch, I reached I reached all the people I wanted to, the public that were there. And the work has been something I'd done for so long. People bought the book and within 2 days they had read it. And I was still recovering from the writing and the presentation. And people were meeting and said, "Loved your book." I said, "When's the next one coming out?" So the pressure was on, which surprised me in the sense that I was really going, they liked it and they wanted a second one. And I hadn't even moved on from the first one. So I was kind of caught off guard. And I had all sorts of thoughts about what to do. Would I do? And people asked me, they gave me ideas. They said, "Would you do the red kite? Would you do the pine marten?" Some people, I think even including yourself, kind of said, "Well, would you go back and do more of your childhood and how you got into nature?" Because that was fascinating. And then John Boorman, who had written the foreword for the first book, I met him shortly afterwards to give him a book and to give him a thank you present. And he started the same thing. "Now you've got your first one out, what's the second one going to be about?" And I'd given that a lot of thought. And then he turned around and said, "Have you thought about the kingfisher?" And I said, "Well, it is a bird. I've often followed him, even watching at the moment." I hadn't thought of it as a subject. Now, John is very, very broad, I suppose, in his experience. And I think he's produced 22 films. And he suddenly gave me insights into the bird I hadn't really seen or thought. And he was very captivated by the bird because he actually had one in the room as we met. It had hit the window and it had landed, and we started just talking about it. And he was especially interested in the mythology, which naturally I was interested in as well. It's just something about.
What would you say is the unique feature for you of the kingfisher?
I suppose it's a contradiction for a bird watcher, the kingfisher, in that it's a vibrantly colored bird. It's vivid blue on the back and lovely brick orange on the front. So it's a bird that should stand out. It's a bird not like a blackbird. You should be able to see it everywhere. And yet an awful lot of people, everybody's familiar with the kingfisher from photographs, from natural history programs, but an awful lot of people have never seen one. It has an elusive lifestyle. And it's a contradiction that it's one of our brightest birds. It's resident in Ireland all the time, and yet its lifestyle goes unnoticed, and it's quite difficult to follow. And the more I started following that, the more I came to realize that and appreciate it. I suppose while I birdwatch all the time, I see an awful lot of birds on a daily basis or a weekly basis, but naturally you don't have time to focus on every single species or you'll be there all your life. So while I saw the kingfisher maybe every week or several times a week, I suddenly realized I knew very little about it. And I suppose the one thing we all know about the kingfisher, and it's the defining feature of it, is the manner in which it feeds. A lot of birds like blackbirds, robins and that, we don't notice it. They just hop around and peck here and there. There's nothing definitive about the way they do it. A robin doesn't feed different to a blackbird. A kingfisher dives into the water. It dives from one realm into another. It lives above the river. It feeds below the river. And the surface of the river is a division. And not many birds do that. And the feat of diving in for such a small bird is an amazing series of calculations that it has to make, that I suppose without studying we fail to appreciate it. I mean, the one example I've always give that's captivated me is anybody who's done physics in school will know from you study the angle of refraction, which basically means something in water isn't where it appears. And if you reach in and grab what you see, it's not there. Kingfisher does this every day and makes all these super calculations in its head, and I just find that incredible for such a small bird. So yes, that, I suppose the dive into from one realm into the other is the defining feature for me of what a kingfisher is.
Gorgeous.
I think it can be daunting for people. I think people sometimes are worried about perhaps seeming ignorant or seeming ill-informed when it comes to wildlife. And I think that's a real pity. I think that it's really important to realize that people come to nature because it's wonderful, because it's mystical, because it says something to us in a very visceral, emotional way. I think that's very important. People can get too caught up in trying to put names to everything that they see. And the thing that I found, and I'm sure Declan will back me up on this, is that the more you know about wildlife, the more you realize you don't know about wildlife. The journey never stops, and it's always just a different standard. So someone who's beginning, we've all been there, and that people shouldn't be put off by that. And I think that that's why, particularly in the case of the Spirit of the River, that the kingfisher is such a brilliant subject, at least primary subject, because it is a real poster campaign bird for wildlife. I think that if the kingfisher didn't exist, organizations like Birdwatch Ireland would have to invent it, because it's so attractive, it's so immediately arresting, it's easy to identify, it's something that people really know very well. Another bird that might fit that mold would be the puffin, another perennial favorite. And it's through that that people then come to an appreciation of nature. And that's one of the things that I really love that Declan has done in this book, is that the kingfisher is the gateway, but when you're learning about the kingfisher and following him in his quest to learn more about it himself, you're learning about so many other creatures which are just as fascinating, but perhaps not immediately so obvious. And I think that's really nice. And that it's all about learning and going on that journey. And that's what I would recommend to people, exactly the way that Declan handles it in this book. It's, you just try and enjoy it, immerse yourself in it, and the knowledge will come.
Lovely.
Very important when people start on this journey. For so many people, there is no looking back, and that's certainly what I'm hoping for the people who are reading your book, that they will start many of them on that path. Because of course, to enjoy this book, you don't have to know anything about nature. It's in many ways as much about you as it is about wildlife and about nature. And of course, as Alan has already alluded to, without giving anything away or talking too much about what happens in the book, it's quite clear in the book that you yourself are going through some difficult times. There's stresses there, and it's very clear how somehow that's obviously intruding on your relationship with nature, and in some ways that you regret that, or even perhaps resent the way it's intruded on your life there, but then also how it saves you as well, how it's the thing you can cling to, it's the thing you can keep coming back to. Am I right in thinking that way? Am I on the right track?
Yes, no, you are, I suppose. Definitely the outside world can intrude. Now, I suppose usually when you go out to nature, you're using it to get away from the world. You're using it to, well, I am, and you're using it to escape. And that's fine, because people don't follow me into when I'm going into the river. But yeah, there was a stressful period where I suppose the worries and the anxieties of a number of issues that I was dealing with became so overwhelming, became so overpowering, that they did follow me into the world. and into the natural world. And that caused a clash, because all of a sudden the natural world wasn't relaxing it. And I started to see, I suppose, the kingfisher, as I've often said, all of a sudden lost its colour. Because what I was going through, I brought in with me, and that tainted the world. The world of nature had been a great world. It had been free, it had been green, it had been almost like, I suppose, a paradise, or almost like a fairyland. But suddenly the outside world decided to follow me in, and it darkened it. And yes, I did resent that. It took a lot of perseverance to get it to balance itself. Not to drive the outside world back out. That would be the wrong way to do it. But I suppose to let nature dominate and become a healer, I suppose, and actually show you how to deal with the outside world and show you how to deal with the issues that were causing the problems. And then the kingfisher got its colours back and everything kind of sorted itself out to a degree. And but yes, you were on the right track with that, which is something that a few things did happen along the way. But that's what happens, I think, as I've always said, when you walk along a river, you can't see round the corner. So you're on a very fast flowing river, you go round the corner and it suddenly divides into two or something. It's always a surprise. And I think for all of us, when we go along the road of life, that happens too. You think you know where you're going and things change.
Yeah, the final chapter is never quite written, is it? Around to books, because there's been an increase in interest in nature during the pandemic. There clearly has been an increase in interest in books as well. They've been a real form of entertainment and escapism for a lot of people. And at a time when we haven't been able to travel, I certainly have found that I've been traveling through books. I was already an avid reader, and I've been reading more than ever before over the last year. And that's something that's going to stick with me. That's something that's given me a lot in my life. It's expanded my view of the world at a time when my physical ability to travel in that world has never been more limited. Just your own relationship with books, Declan, is that something you found as well? Or how's that been for you?
I've always been an avid reader since I was 8, 9 or 10. And I think certainly as you start writing, you actually start to read more, because you need to broaden your way of thinking, you need to broaden your vocabulary, you need to broaden your experience, and you need to see how other people handle similar experiences as what you're going through, and find out when you're worried about something, kind of saying like, "Oh, I wonder, should I include this personal thing?" And when you read 4 or 5 books where people have put in even more personal things, some people have put in very personal things, and you realize you're writing, goodness, that was very brave of them. And I think, yes, certainly during the pandemic, we've all read a bit more. We've all, I suppose, because we've had our freedom restricted so much. I think that's a good thing. I think also as a writer, you come to appreciate an awful lot more books, because you become appreciative of how much the writer must have invested himself. I mean, for example, some well-known natural history writers and presenters went through very dark times. And there was one where there was the writer attempted suicide. And we read that, and I suppose as a writer now, all of a sudden you realize, had that been me, would that have been possible to write about? So you do develop a better appreciation of people, how the effort they put into it, which I suppose if I wasn't involved in writing, you mightn't have appreciated as much the difficulty that person went through. So certainly during the pandemic and during the writing of this book, I probably read more than I'd read a lot of years. Now, having said that, there was a few other authors that were writing books at the same time, and they published theirs before mine. I had to be very careful not to read theirs, because I decided that I didn't want to have my story affected by how somebody else might tell a similar story. So I did, for a period there in the latter half of writing the book, I stopped reading an awful lot of books altogether. But yeah, I think we all probably kind of read a bit. I think that's a great thing, because books, the great thing about books is that everybody who reads a book interprets it differently. It's a unique journey. It's a journey into someone's mind. It's a journey into someone's world. And you think you know what the writer is talking about, and someone else who reads the book would be totally different. So it's a unique experience to read another book, to see someone's insight. It's never straightforward, and the more you read, I suppose, the more you'll understand this. But it's one of the greatest gifts anybody can have, is to read. And I just hope an awful lot of children growing up nowadays don't lose that. But certainly, I don't think they will.
This is Lucy, my Dalmatian. I've had Lucy since she was a puppy of 6 weeks old, and that was over 5 years ago. I'm very, very fortunate. Lucy gets to spend nearly all day, every day with me. From when I wake up in the morning until I go to bed in the evening, Lucy's there beside me. Because she's always with me, it was inevitable that she was going to become part of the story. Not just because she's a great companion and a great friend, but also because she's a character in her own right. If I want to play, Lucy comes and plays. If I want to go and look at foxes or badgers, she does that too. And if I want to sit beside the river and just look at kingfishers, she'll do that too. And sometimes if I just need a bit of support and a shoulder to lean on, she's pretty good at that as well. Because she's part of the story, she appears in all the illustrations throughout the book, and especially on the cover, which was painted by my friend Clodagh Power. It shows a lovely picture of myself and Lucy in silhouette walking along the riverbank, Lucy leading the way as we set off to follow the kingfisher along the river alongside me here. That's the way the story happened, and that's the way we decided to tell the story. I hope you like Spirit of the River. We certainly enjoyed it.
Birdwatching can kind of open up doors into all sorts of ways. Like, okay, the book that I've written 2 books now on birds, and those many of those, both those books refer back to taking notes, which is something you do and I do automatically. It's you know, you're it's part of being a bird watcher. You're kind of taking notes.
Yeah,
it's something that I kind of find that an awful lot of people, they probably think this is the most nerdiest, geekiest aspect of actually watching nature that there is. It stands out in my mind going right back to I think it was my French teacher in school. They were trying to kind of get me prepared for the French orals, and they were teaching me about how to talk about bird migration in French, which was a disaster. I could hardly talk about it in English, so it was a disaster talking about it in French. But they were asking to explain notes, and I think this is a misconception, because I know you're a good note taker, that the whole concept of bird watching, people have this idea, I think, with birds, that you go out, you sit and you look at them, and you write down, today I saw a kingfisher, today I saw, or you saw one woodpecker, one grey-crested grebe, and one sparrowhawk. You write those 3 birds down, you have a little notebook, and you just write a list. And I think, I don't know, has that perception changed? But certainly when I was growing up, there was that perception that bird watching was really just like list making, in the sense of like train spotting.
train spotting.
You collected the birds, you ticked them off, and you wrote them down in your notebook. Sparrow, starling, mallard. I think, that's something that a lot of people don't realize, that I suppose when we talk about taking notes and writing about birds, we're doing an awful lot more about that. It's not, well, I find I'm writing, when I write my notes, they're a narrative.
Yeah.
Would your notes be like that as well? Like a sort of a diary almost of the whole experience, the birds, the environment, the setting you're in?
Yeah, a lot of my notes would be kind of detailed stuff to do with identification work, usually. So if I see something kind of interesting that maybe I haven't seen that kind of plumage or something before, or maybe if it's a rarity or something like that, I might take extensive kind of notes. But in terms of common birds, it'd be more like a diary, as you say.
Yeah, and it's funny, those diaries can actually lead in, very much lead into the whole art of writing then from there on. Because I think all the good famous naturalists, all the, will always refer back to the nature diaries they kept as a child.
Yeah.
And I've still got some of my nature diaries going back to when I was 7 or 8 here. And even the writing of those recent books, I've looked back and I've referred back to them.
Now, my background is in mythologist. I'm this rare endangered species called a mythologist. So Moriarty's incredible dexterity when it comes to a knowledge of, for example, is Indian, you know, the Vedas through to the, you know, the Upanishads, through to Beowulf, through to Black Elk. That kind of agility is dazzling, but I recognized quickly what he was doing. But what is so unique about John, for me, Moriarty's work, is that on the one hand, he has that kind of almost universal ability to dive deep wherever he goes. But at the other, he really remains rooted in Kerry. He remains utterly localized. And that combination of intense depth and great diversity of growth was pretty dazzling to me. Like everybody else, he threatens your erudition at first, and you realize you've got a bit of reading to do and a bit of thinking to do and a bit of brooding to do. But what's been so wonderful for me is in the last 10 years, every now and then I'll be working with a group of students, both here and in the States, and I'll talk about John, and we'll just work into one or two of his ideas. And freed from that initial overwhelming experience of trying to read his great canon, which I would suggest for most people do it incrementally, bit by bit, the students jumped into the great wrestle you have in any good Moriarty text and loved it. And I suddenly realized that we were talking about someone with an extraordinary ecological message, a little bit ahead of his time, probably behind his time and ahead of his time.
Yeah.
And so you and I met, didn't we, about 18 months ago?
Yes,
And
that book you and Tommy Tennant gave. Yeah.
Yes, and I think almost instantly there was the possibility between us of something like this happening. But it's to you and Lilliput's eternal credit that about a year ago we said, okay, let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's try and get it out on his, you know, on the month of his death, and we pulled it off. So the thing that was so extraordinary about Moriarty is, on the one hand, he's digging into a kind of Christianity we barely have the words for yet. And at the same time, he's so porous as a thinker, he keeps bringing in other faiths, other philosophies under this wide, extraordinary kind of Christianity that he's beginning to blow on the embers of. I haven't come across that yet ever so successfully done. And of course, what's so hard is that just as we remember, he was saying, okay, a hedge school for Kerry, he realizes that he's at the end of his life.
Yeah. And he wrote that wonderful little book as a sort of farewell called Serious Sounds, where he really reverted to his earliest faith, I think.
Yeah.
Quoting the Philip Larkin chapter.
Very famous photograph, isn't there? Well, it's famous amongst Moriarty fans, of John in his front room, surrounded by piles of books. Absolutely.
Featuring piles, yeah.
And so,
pillars.
yeah, at the end of this, I described them as his Stonehenge, his Eros.
Yes, you have a beautiful passage.
Well, it was a feeling. One of the things that is attractive to me in John's work is a kind of introversion that I can detect. And like a lot of people, I'm not remotely unique in this. That's something I experience in myself, even though I manage to occasionally channel it into a civic and public life. I fell in love with the language. I fell in love with the difficulty. I fell in love with the wrestle. But I did feel the one thing that possibly I could add to this great Moriartyan conversation is try and open a door, and this is very much part of what you and I were talking about, to an audience
that maybe simply wouldn't bang into him. Maybe they're not in Ireland, maybe they're in the States, maybe they're younger, because...
Well, this is your following. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
You're passing the torch. Yeah.
Yeah, really trying to do that, because I think a Moriarty consciousness is a very good idea. And I just say this one thing. When you're presented with his canon and you open up the books, it can be a bit overwhelming, but actually some of his essential ideas are digestible. They really are digestible because, as you said, Antony, he provides you with the tools to unpack it. Moriarty is doing what William Blake did before him and the Rhineland mystics did before him, and you know, all sorts of visionary characters. And it's this: if you just spend your life looking at the world, you risk burnout. If you can behold the world, everything changes. I've said this a million times. I'm walking through London and I see a thistle. William Blake walking by me sees a little grey man waving at him. John would see the little grey man too. And that for me is why I felt I wanted to do this work. When you're in the middle of your own work as a writer, to take effectively a year out to devote your labours to someone else has to be an act of love. It has to be an act of respect. Otherwise, you simply wouldn't do it. I was edified by this. Do you remember the situation we ended up in, Antony, where we realised that quite a lot of the texts we wanted to get to hadn't been digital. They weren't digital.
Yeah, it was pre-digital.
I sat there through the winter, and of course there was an option of paying someone to do that, but I took it like a metaphysical task. Well, no, it wasn't a metaphysical task, it was a very real one. But I thought, I'll get to know John in a different way if I type this out. So like a little Lindisfarne monk, I scribed away and feel the better for it.
Yeah.
The wonderful thing is Moriarty can't really be franchised. He's not very good as a hashtag. You can't really pin down a gleaming match fit form of Celtic Christianity from it. It's this rumbling atmosphere rather than an A to a B to a C. And to be honest, you either like that kind of thing or you just don't. And I realized the one thing that felt important with A Hut at the Edge of the Village was to begin with a sense of where he came from, a sense of his childhood, and then move from those incredible local stories that he tells, you know, or when I say local, I mean place-based. The story of Big Mike, that incredible night when he walks back from the pub with Martin. And then gradually, if you can chew on that, if you can, you know, keep that in the meat hall of your jaw, then possibly the bigger and the growingly wilder ecological thinking that he does comes at you. It's not quite so much a shock. And to encourage, if you like A Hut at the Edge of the Village, get the other books. Lilliput have a whole quiver of them, you know. Be fiscally bankrupt for a while and spiritually replete. Yeah, there they are.
There they are. The beginning and the end. You know, Dreamtime, such a wonderfully... It was launched by Michael D. Higgins before he became president. And we were pushing people out the door. I think we sold 500 copies. Such was the expectation.
Oh, nice.
That
Martin Shaw, I have been deep in your mind these last few weeks, just like imbibing the Smokehold Sessions, this new series of podcasts you're doing with Chelsea Green. And like I had always, it's so different. I had dropped into your books and I'd read and I got so much from Wolf Milk and from Night Wages and from previous works. But to be listening to you talking, you know, these intimate conversations with some really powerful thinkers, and this beautiful mix of thinkers and storytellers and writers from all sort of angles, from Jan Blake to Jeff Griffiths to John Mitchinson to Tommy Tiernan. And so now to like roll up our sleeves and to explore your latest project, which is so brave. It's so sort of just out there to try and find a way of talking about John Moriarty. So first, like, I bow to you for daring to do this even.
Thank you, Manchán. It's so nice to see you again. The last time we were together, I think it was in Dublin about 18 months ago, and the notion, just the seed of this book had been kind of murmured between me and Antony Farrell from Lilliput. And I'm delighted it is rather surreal. It is rather a surreal moment to actually be here talking about one of Ireland's greatest secrets to the rest of the world, the extraordinary exfoliation of the work of John Moriarty. About 10 years ago, I think I realized that I loved Flann O'Brien more than I loved Plato. And my life changed pretty much from that moment. And I've been reading John diligently for about 10 years.
And like, already you have done so much to serve the wisdom of these islands, through, as you say, through your work of storytelling and your work of mythology, and finding ways to make them alive again for generations, by performing them, by writing them in new ways, by digging down into the bits that are dusty and refreshing them and refinding new ways. So that's one previous work. But then for you to also take on Moriarty, and as you mentioned, like Antony Farrell, it's so important to mention. So John, anything could have happened to John Moriarty at any moment. He could have ended up in a ditch so easily. Like, the man had so much wisdom, but he was constantly almost trying to trip himself up and trying to stop the information getting out there. And it was really thanks to Antony Farrell's patience over years, to coax him into writing the books, to coax him to deliver them, to try and coax him to edit them, though that never went very well. And so we do have this lore, this body of knowledge, all through Lilliput Press, the likes of What the Curlew Said and Night Journey to Bodgaia and Dreamtime and Turtle was a long time gone, and then all his CDs, his talks. And as Tommy Tiernan, I think, said in one of your podcasts, that, you know, there is one accessible way. It's slightly easier to get through him through his CDs. But so Lilliput have all of these, but as you say, they're not really known, particularly not outside Ireland. So, should we give the briefest summary of John Moriarty? Would you be able to sum him up in a sentence or two? Is that possible?
I probably, you know, as we all know, trying to sum John up is like trying to grab a salmon. It moves this way and that way in your hands. It glints magnificently and then is gone. What we know about him is that in this incarnation, at least, he was born in 1938. He died in 2007. Absolutely to his boots, a Kerry man. And that for me is one of the really, really compelling parts of his work. And is more than anything, you know, and he was a par excellence oral storyteller. I think his books are extraordinary, and they are very similar in pace and rhythm to how he actually spoke. He was really, I think, just entering his stride when he suddenly realized he was at the end of his life. A hedge school for Kerry, that was what he really longed for. And what's so extraordinary about Moriarty, he always described himself as a singing Christian, which is rather lovely. That I'm a singing Christian, but the kind of Christianity that Moriarty is proposing is not the fat blonde American type. It is the Jesus that turns up, and when he gives you the good news, it may feel very much like the bad news. This is he with his little karmic stick, Moriarty helps create space around Christ again, whilst having this, and this is, you know, that this is riven thick in Irish myth and poetry. There's a beautiful porosity between his pagan soul and his Christian heart. So I've done a terrible job of describing him, but that's my first hurl of language.
No, that's so alluring. It is exactly that. And like, so many people have been touched by him, and we think we need to get the message out further. And yet we haven't so far. We've all failed. And even Lilliput have put out edited versions before by Michael Higgins and Brendan O'Donoghue, and yet no one knows them. And what's so different about your book is just the audacity and the quality of your writing. Like, as you say, you've written a long time, and you've written different styles and different formats in your life. But like, your writing has the same vivacity and wildness and boldness and sense of humor and devilment as Moriarty does. And so this is both in your introductions and then in your chapter introductions. You've divided your exploration of Moriarty into things like ecology and story and hugeness and Christianity and death. But each chapter, you're just, because it's hard to do Moriarty, and yet we are lured, we are soothed, we are embalmed by your words. You start off with trying to coax us into him, saying things that we are sometimes chasing a leaping hare, not a bridge builder. If we attempt to swallow the ocean, we drown, but a salty drop dabbed on our forehead may be a great blessing. Like, I could quote you and I could quote Moriarty so often, and you wouldn't know which is which. You both have this force of nature through your voice. Were you consciously at first trying to lure us in by taking these easy stories that we could understand?
Yes, I think there's an element of that. I wanted, John is a kind of astrophysics, isn't he, really? So on one moment you're seeing a blackthorn bush, then it's trembling with particles, then it's a blackthorn bush again. He's making all of these moves. So I wanted to start in the ground that he grew up in. I wanted to hear a bit about the quiet kindness of his father when he said he realized his son didn't want to live wasn't going to be a farmer, and gets on his bike. I mean, it moves me almost to tears that his dad paid for him to go through university. Well, think of his father's contribution to Irish culture in that moment. It's utterly magnificent. So I wanted to situate John in a place, and it's a little bit like, those awful stories about you put a goldfish in a tank, and if you heat it up slowly, it doesn't realize how hot it's getting. The book is a bit like that. We start with the rooted, we start with the local, and then it builds and it builds and it builds. But what I tried to provide is a companionable warmth all the way through. And I'm walking, there's an angel up ahead. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. And actually, a lot of what John has been criticized for over the years, repetitions of stories, sometimes even within the same book, that is an old oral technique. You must understand that this is a man who doesn't think in a straight line. It's not A, B, C, D. It's like Plotinus. The soul moves in circles, and so does John. Let me have a grapple with the book that's just turned up, and in typical Lilliput style is beautifully handsome. Very important. Smells terrific. Nice cover. So let me think, what was I up to? I mean, just listen to these titles of John's. Horses walking spellbound. I no longer smelled of thunder. I no longer smelled of thunder. Good God. Silver branch beholding, crossing the torrent, Hamlet to my own skull, genius in every stone. It's sort of embarrassing, the riches that John is carrying in his pocket. And John, most attractively for me, he's a great rescuer of thrown away stories. He walks back from the pub with his mate Martin, and in those two hours you have a sort of Joycean odyssey going on. And he's so overwhelming to a new reader. One of the things I wanted to do with this book is not to franchise him, not to hashtag him, not to reduce him in any way whatsoever, but to say there are some essential energetic, what he would call seal holes in his work. And if you dive down them, your life will never look the same again. And that could apply to someone working in a garage in Dunleary, through to, you know, a poet on the edge of Dartmoor where I live. I wanted to say that really, for me, the big move with John is from seeing the world to beholding it. Now, of course, that sounds trite. Of course, it sounds obvious. But of course, behind Moriarty is William Blake. Behind William Blake are any number of bardic figures. And when you are exhausted by life, when you're lonely, when you're confused and when you're tired, it's hard to keep beholding. It's hard to see, you know, eternity in a grain of sand. But that mandate is central to what John is doing. So that's the thing I tried to get to in the introduction, which is, as you, I'm glad you picked up on it. Don't try and drink this thing all in one go. You're going to get the bends. But what would it be to tell the story of the Hound of Ulster? What would it be to learn how to scythe a field? What would it be to go to the west of Ireland and dig into the curvaceousness of the language? Those are John's invitations. There are very few people walking around on this planet with his hallucinatory erudition. That's how I would describe it, hallucinatory erudition. But for us mere mortals, we can come in under his wingspan and not mimic him, not do that, because he wouldn't be interested in that, but just take one or two grains and go and do our own work with it. So